as we pull out of the climate agreement, China will benefit from that. It will take up, quote, a leadership position in the fight for to control climate change. And when we walk out of the World Health Organization, as Trump has announced we will do, the Chinese will step into the gap.
Well, good evening. Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Kalideep Chowdhury, and I'm here to talk to my distinguished guest, Professor Casimir Yost, from the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And we are here to talk about conflicts in the Trumpian age. A special welcome to all of you, including our online participants. This program is a focus on world affairs from the Asia-Pacific Affairs and is being recorded and live-streamed on the Commonwealth Club YouTube channel and will be available for download later on at the club's website. Thank you for joining us. We encourage you to become a member of the club. Over the last few months, we've gained 800 new members. So, to learn more about us and our many activities, please visit the club's website. And before we jump in, a quick reminder, your cell phone's off. And if you have any questions, we'll have volunteers going through audience. You can please write your questions, and they'll be handed over to me during the course of our talk.
Write them on what?
They'll hand over these little slips in a few minutes. So let us begin. There's an ancient Chinese proverb, or probably a curse. May you live in interesting times. When the subject of the discussion was first broached, Professor Yost and I decided that we would focus on a few key hotspots around the world. Distant hotspots. We talk about China, Taiwan, we talk about Russia, Ukraine, and we talk about the Middle East. But that was just a few weeks ago. And as Groucho Marx once put it, we've all passed a lot of water since. And now we find ourselves bringing into the conversation many of the hot spots very uncomfortably close to us. There's Greenland, there's the Panama Canal, there's the Gulf of Mexico, there's tariffs. And so who better to help us understand and navigate through these swirling news in this dawning of this new Trumpian age than Professor Yost. He's a senior fellow at the Institute of Diplomacy, at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, and he teaches at the Walsh School of Foreign Service. From 2009 to 2013, Casimir served on the National Intelligence Council, where he directed the Strategic Futures Group and his predecessor, the Long Range Analysis Unit. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, I'd like to welcome, a very warm welcome to the Commonwealth Club, to Professor Yost. Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. So Cass, as we go through these transitions from one administration to the other, help us understand, put us in context, what we can and cannot expect over the next few years from a Trumpian perspective.
Well, I'm not sure I can echo the Trumpian perspective, but I do want to say at the outset that I'm delighted to be back in the Bay Area. Whenever I come here, I reflect on the fact that the first time I went under the Golden Gate Bridge was in 1955, when I got on the President Wilson and headed for the Far East. My father had been appointed as U.S. ambassador to Vientiane, Laos. And so that was my first visit to the Bay Area. And then my family and I came here in 1986, and I headed the precursor to the joint Commonwealth Club World Affairs Council organization for 4 years. I was president of the World Affairs Council of Northern California, and then moved over to the Asia Foundation, where my wife also worked. She headed the Women's Empowerment Program there, and she too she's in the room here this evening. So we have a lot of ties to the Bay Area. But I'm reminded whenever I come here that Washington is a continent away. And in Washington, at this very moment, at this very week, there's a hostile takeover in process. And I use that word, hostile, with some emphasis. When I went to work in the U.S. Senate for a Republican member of the Senate, senior Republican member of the Senate, he never asked me whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. That was in 1977. In 1982, I went to work for the Republican side of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And nobody ever asked me whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. In 2009, I went into the Obama administration and to work at the National Intelligence Council, which is located in the CIA building in Langley. And nobody ever asked me whether I was a Republican or a Democrat. But today we live in an intensely partisan environment in Washington, and everything is observed through the prism of loyalty to party. And what has changed really in the last number of days is that the new prism is not just loyalty to party, but loyalty to President Trump. It is not widely perceived across the country just how dramatic the shift is from one administration to another. The new National Security Advisor walked into the building to White House shortly after 12:01 on Monday afternoon, and he immediately set about cleaning out the staff of the National Security Council. Not the political appointees that Biden had brought in, because those left promptly without being asked. But I'm talking about the detailees from different agencies that help staff the government. And these have now been asked to go home and sit on their hands while it is determined whether they will be loyal enough to the agenda of the new administration. Across government, in departments of government, this same thing is happening. Everybody's being vetted. Anyone who was a political appointee in the last administration is leaving. But the career staff is also being vetted. And it is not a secret that some of the people in high places in the new administration have said that they are at war with the deep state, with the career bureaucracy. Now, I tell you all this by way of saying that the rest of the world doesn't stop while we go through this transition. And so I note with some regularity that the most vulnerable period for the United States is the first year of a transition from one administration to another when there is a change in party. Because the old folks who've been in office for 4 or 8 years are departing, and the new folks who have not had recent government experience, or in some cases not any government experience, are coming in. The risks that this transition pose are captured well by 2001. The Bush administration came into office, and Richard Clark, who was a holdover from the Clinton administration, walked into Condi Rice's office. Condi Rice, now at Stanford, but then Bush's national security advisor, gave her a memo in which he said, "You've got to pay attention to Al-Qaeda. You have to pay attention to Al-Qaeda," and he put it in writing. During the course of the summer, my friend George Tenet, the CIA director, sent messages into Bush and to Rice saying, Al-Qaeda is going to hit us. Al-Qaeda is going to hit the United States. And there is a declassified memo to the President of the United States in August of 2001 saying, we will be hit. I sat in my office on the Georgetown campus on September 11th, 2001, and my assistant came in and said, Cass, you need to look at CNN. So I went downstairs, and the first plane had already hit the Twin Tower. I watched the second plane go into it. And then shortly thereafter, someone yelled, there's smoke rising from the Pentagon down the river. And then the fourth plane, of course, went into a field in Pennsylvania. Many lessons to be learned from that. But the most profound and important lesson, and your takeaway should be, that administration, highly competent, Colin Powell, Rumsfeld, any number of highly competent people, came in with the assumption that the big challenge that they would face would be China or Russia. And it turned out to be Al-Qaeda, bin Laden. So assumptions matter, and we now have yet another administration coming into office with firmly fixed assumptions. And those assumptions are being implemented as we speak, as President Trump takes us out of the climate agreement, takes us out of the World Health Organization, makes threats against Denmark with respect to Greenland, makes threats against Panama with respect to the canal, and threatens everybody when it comes to tariffs. Now, we know what he's saying. What we don't know yet is what he's going to do. But if you ask me, should we be worried? My answer is we should be worried, not just because of what he might do, but because the corrosive effect that it has on America's standing in the world. Much of my life and much of my father's life has been in the field of public service. And so I'm deeply disturbed when some of these people come in and they claim that public servants are not contributing to the national good, claim that they're going to root out a deep state, when these are the same people that are securing the United States around the world. I'll close, and then I think what we're going to do is work through some of these difficult agenda items that will be on the new administration's to-do list. But I'll close with one observation. As we sit here, either today, later today, or tomorrow, there will be, I believe, a vote on Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense designate. I think it is fair to say that of the 17 people who have been nominated by a president and have held that position since 1947, Hegseth is the least qualified of those 17. He has virtually no administrative experience. He rose to the rank of major. His personal issues have been broadcast to the United States Senate and to the American people. And yet he is poised and will probably lead an organization with in excess of 3 million civilian and military personnel, and a budget in excess of $800 million. By no stretch of the imagination is he qualified to be the next Secretary of Defense. And yet, this man, who will be 6th or 7th in the line of succession after Trump, is poised to become the next Secretary of Defense. So with that mild comment, let's go into the
So,
Q&A.
Cass, what I'd really like to do, you brought up a number of interesting subjects and topics. What I'd really like to do is focus on the hotspots around the world rather than on internal affairs. But as you go through these subjects, I'd like you to look at them through the prism of what Donald Rumsfeld once said, known knowns, known unknowns. But you also brought up the black swan about the Al-Qaeda. And perhaps if you could lay it around, you mentioned the corrosive effect of America. What do these have on the idea of America? There's always this idea of America. And so if you could, let us perhaps begin by choosing the most distant hotspot. Let's talk about China and Taiwan.
Okay.
Explain for us, if you will, President Xi Jinping's rationale for invading Taiwan.
Right. So, Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, held the job twice, actually, got up at a press conference while he was Secretary of Defense, and he said, I want to talk about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And a lot of people sort of said, oh, well, what's he babbling about? He's trying to confuse us or whatever. But there was method in his madness. He actually borrowed those categories from a famous CIA analyst. And what he meant about it was that there are known knowns, issues that we know a lot about, but they can yet challenge us. And an obvious example is climate change. We know a lot about climate change. We track it, but we can't necessarily get the political will to get it together, to address it. Demography is another one. When I was born, world population was roughly 2.5 billion. Today it is in excess of 8 billion. And that has all sorts of ripple effects. So these are two issues on which we know a lot, but we can't necessarily figure out how to address them in ways that are politically palatable. But then there's this other category, what he called known unknowns. And this is, we know we have a problem, but we don't know what the direction of the problem is. And China fits comfortably in that. We know a great deal about Xi Jinping. We know that he's consolidated power in Beijing in a way that is reminiscent of Mao Zedong. He's got all of the levers of authority under him. He's extended his legal stay. The party has voted to keep him in office in the presidency and as general secretary. And we know that he is building up capabilities. The attitude towards China has been a source of great continuity between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. Both labeled China as a strategic competitor. And there is a lot that the Chinese are doing that legitimately should concern us. But what they're doing with respect to Taiwan is filled with uncertainty. An invasion could create as many problems for them as it would solve, and yet he has set the return of Taiwan to the Chinese mainland Chinese fold as an objective of his tenure in office. We know that he's tightening the screws on the Taiwanese. We know that Taiwan today is literally in recent days has voted to not implement portions of their defense budget. You can imagine, I think, how this is read in the new Trump administration. Trump pays a lot of attention to how much money our friends and allies spend on their own defense. And to have the Taiwanese say, well, we're going to limit how much we spend on defense is not encouraging for them. So one of the issues that the Trump administration will confront is what do we do if Xi Jinping decides this is the time, this is the opportunity for us to, in effect, deflect attention from problems at home and ratchet up the pressure on Taiwan. A cross-straits invasion, I think, is unlikely, but in part because the Popular Liberation Front does, the PLA does not have to do that. All it has to do is interfere with air traffic and boat traffic in and out of Taiwan. So that's going to be an issue that the administration could face in days and weeks ahead.
And has the administration, in its own way, has the American government in its own way tied its hands up after Jimmy Carter agreed to a one China policy? And now the question then becomes, and we don't have an embassy in Taiwan, then how does then the United States then step into this fray?
Well, President Biden, in part in I would say, not entirely in a way that made his own staff comfortable. On 2 or 3 occasions said, well, of course we'll come to the defense of Taiwan if it's invaded. And his staff had to walk back those comments because we have said our announced policy is that the United States considers that there is but one China, and that that any differences between Taiwan and the mainland should be settled peaceably. But we do not. We have. We provide security support to Taiwan, but we do not have, for example, the same sort of defense treaty that we have with South Korea or with Japan. So it is very definitely, we don't have the same commitments that we do with other countries. So what would the United States do in the event of either an invasion or of a blockade? That is very clearly an unknown.
And would you have been a lot more comfortable stating that unknown in a different administration, or do you feel that this new administration brings this air of uncertainty to it?
Well, I think it brings an air of uncertainty because you've got individuals within the administration, notably the Secretary of State, who's been very clear. But the president of the new president, or the renewed president of the United States, has been less clear on whether he feels the United States is committed to the defense of Taiwan. So it's an unknown.
And do you think that this is further complicated by the fact that Trump recently reached out to China for help in Ukraine?
Yeah.
And that no matter what, on the fight of global warming, we do need China inside the tent rather than outside.
Right. So there's the confusion. People say, well, we're in a new Cold War. But you'll remember in the Cold War, our adversary, the Soviet Union, had virtually no economic clout or significant economic relationship with us. And it was both a military and an ideological struggle. Today, we have a very complex relationship with the mainland. It's little noted, but the second largest number of foreign students in the United States are Chinese. If you walk around the Georgetown campus, you see a lot of Chinese students. We have a massive trade relationship with the mainland. And as you quite properly point out, it is very difficult to imagine arms control as we've known it during and since the Cold War, arms control proceeding without China being part of the conversation. It is impossible to imagine effective action against climate change proceeding without cooperation between the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases, China and the United States. And it is difficult to believe that that in the event of another pandemic, cooperation between China and the United States would not be essential. And yet, what we've seen, both in I want to emphasize this, both in Democratic and Republican administrations, we've stepped back from having a robust international trade approach to international trade. We've, under both Biden and Trump, we've become more protectionist as a nation. And the Chinese have benefited from that. Now, as we pull out of the climate agreement. China will benefit from that. It will take up, quote, a leadership position in the fight for to control climate change. And when we walk out of the World Health Organization, as Trump has announced we will do, the Chinese will step into the gap. So you have to look at it, I have to look at it at least, as not only what others are doing to us, but the wounds that we are inflicting to ourselves.
Thank you. Let's now shift closer to the West. Let's take a look at Russia and Ukraine. What's the end game?
Do you have $1 million? So I think the end game, unfortunately, first of all, let me say, there's absolutely no question that Russia has been bled by this war and bled grievously. Their economy has been able to survive the fighting, if only because of oil revenues, ability to sell oil and gas, oil to China, but also because they've put their economy on a war footing, and so as they're churning out weapons and so on, that has had a positive effect. But they've taken massive human losses, killed and wounded, and their security environment has become much more complicated because both Finland and Sweden have joined NATO. And so the border that Russia has to secure has just expanded significantly. And so, does Putin have regrets? I don't know what's in his head. But having said that, we seem to be at what amounts to a significant stalemate, and it is seems clear that Trump would like to get this issue off his plate. Whether he's able to or not is another thing, another issue. He's got in his administration at least 2 or 3 of his senior people who could be identified as Ukraine hawks. They are not eager to throw Ukraine under the bus, but again, this is an uncertainty as we approach the days and weeks ahead. Just how committed, and as you'll all remember, Trump has his own peculiar relationship with Ukraine from his first term. So it remains to be seen what position he will adopt. What is clear is that he intends to use his particular approach to public policy to squeeze more defense expenditures out of our European allies. And that's something that both Democrats and Republicans can agree with, that the U.S. has given significant sums to the defense of Europe, and it's entirely appropriate that Europeans, particularly since they are so closely vulnerable to Russia, that Europeans step up and increase their defense expenditures. But Ukraine will be on the docket for for the indefinite future for Trump, and we'll see where he goes on it.
So, Cass, if I could be a little provocative, is some of this our own making? After all, when the Soviet Union broke down, we'd agreed, at least there was a handshake agreement, not to bring NATO to the borders of Russia. But since then, there have been countries, such as the ones that you mentioned, Lithuania, etc., that who all agreed now to join NATO. Does that not make a great power like Russia nervous about the intentions of the United States?
Right.
And I think it was at some point Putin there was even conversations about Russia joining such an organization.
Right. So that's the argument. That's the argument that somehow the West and the United States in particular incited this this action by Putin with respect to Ukraine, and that his justification for going into Ukraine has been that Russian security is compromised there. And that's an argument that he parades whenever asked. It's an argument that I don't think holds any weight. I've spoken to Secretary Baker about this, and he says, we never had an agreement on that. There's nothing in writing. But the fact of the matter is that all of Russia's neighbors are nervous. And all that his invasion of Ukraine, completely unprovoked, all of his, that invasion underlies the fact that they have reasons to be nervous. He has coveted Ukraine. He believes it is part of Russia proper, and was determined to create new facts, but overreached, and now finds himself in this debilitating war. What's left undecided is what's the end game. It may well be that he will gain, at least temporarily or for the foreseeable future, a chunk of Ukrainian land, which he will effectively absorb. But that still leaves a Ukraine insecure. And while there's, I don't think, any great groundswell of enthusiasm to bring Ukraine into NATO, there is concern that that if the fighting is paused, he will retool and rearm and try again, having learned lessons from his failure this time.
Thank you. Now we come to another hot spot, the Middle East. You've talked about in your talks and your lectures the black swan about the Hamas attack on Israel. But more recently, there was another black swan, the collapse of the Assad regime. Did intelligence ever see that coming? Or was there something, it's been around for a long time, and suddenly it collapsed in a matter of weeks? What implications does it have on the stability of the Middle East and perhaps on any potential peace agreements?
So, my wife and I first went to the Middle East in 1968 as teaching fellows at the boarding school next to the American University of Beirut, and we had a chance to travel throughout the region, and including to Israel, where a remarkable Israeli diplomat by Ehud Avaril, was our host. And he took us up on the Golan Heights, which had been captured the year before from Syria. And he said, Carol, Cass, we're standing up on the heights and you can see the Mediterranean, and the Syrian guns were up here and they were pounding us in the Galilee between the Golan Heights and the Mediterranean. And he said, that's our reality. Fast forward to 2024. Let's fast forward to October 7th first. There were female members of the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, perched on the Gaza border, who warned their male superiors that strange training and other activity was happening in Gaza. They were observing preparations that they found ominous. And their superiors sloughed them off. You know, these were females. What did they know? And so Israel was surprised. And when the fighting stops, I'm sure there'll be an intense investigation of what went wrong. And our intelligence community was surprised because we were relying on Mossad and to tell us of any risks within the Palestinian community. And so the Israelis responded, as we responded after October 11th. The Israelis responded first by pounding Gaza, then when Hezbollah launched attacks from the north, pounding Hezbollah and hitting targets in Syria. And in effect responding to everything that Iran was attempting to pile onto Israel. And so you can legitimately say that Israel was responding to threats in its neighborhood. The real debate is the nature and the extent of that response. Shortly after October 7th, a former colleague of mine from the intelligence community, I wrote a small piece for the Atlantic Council, which went up on their website, in which we recommended that the Israelis let women and children and the elderly out of Gaza and stick them in the Negev, relatively unpopulated, and that the international community provide support for these people. In effect, take them out of the war zone. Well, you know, others suggested that, but the Israelis were not interested in letting 1 million Palestinians into the Negev, even if they were women and children. And so the result now is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 45,000, 46,000, 47,000, half of whom were women and children, have been killed by Israeli actions. Gaza has been virtually leveled. And there is no day after plan. Biden administration had a day after plan. The day after plan was let's move to negotiations for a two-state solution. Israelis are not interested in that. The dilemma that Israel faces, and I'm going to throw a statistic at you, but I want you to reflect on it. Today, there are roughly the same number of Palestinians, including Israeli Palestinians, living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean as there are Jewish Israelis. Roughly 50-50. And the question for the future is, if Israel does not give Palestinians a state of their own on the West Bank, what happens to 5 or 6 million Palestinians? Does Israel become de facto an apartheid state, having to control a restive population forever? Tony Blinken, who is a great friend of Israel, in his valedictory address last week said that, and I'm quoting here, "We assess that Hamas has been able to recruit roughly the same number of fighters that were killed by Israel since October 7th. All across the Palestinian territories, in the West Bank, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and of course in Gaza, there are brothers and cousins and fathers bent on revenge. So this is the hand that has been dealt to the Trump administration. They didn't ask for it, but they've got it. And somehow they're going to have to figure out how big a role we're going to play, or whether we're going to step back from this mess. Huge challenge.
So then I have two follow-up questions. One is, you've called Israel, along with Iran, a destabilizer in the Middle East.
Right.
General Petraeus, in his congressional testimony, said that Israel was a strategic liability to the United States. But that's seen in isolation. You also have other Arab states. You have Saudi Arabia, etc. How does that all fit into this puzzle, along with the challenge of Israel rapidly becoming an apartheid state, if it isn't already one already?
Right. So one of the reasons I'm worried about Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense, it is little noted that the U.S. has over 800 bases, military bases around the world. We are positioned all over Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, and it can be legitimately asked, is the United States overextended? And should we be pulling back from some of these commitments? And so to deal with your question, should we pull back from the Middle East and simply say, over to you? Or should the new administration fulfill the promise of the Abraham Accords, which the Trump administration in its first terms negotiated, which had Gulf states joining Jordan and Egypt in diplomatic relations with Israel. And the goal that the Biden administration pursued was to bring Saudi Arabia into the mix. But Saudi Arabia, I think it is clear, is not prepared to take that step unless the Israelis are going to be prepared to do something substantial on the Palestinian issue. And so that's the conundrum that the Trump administration now faces.
So we've talked about hotspots around the world. Let's come closer to home. Let's talk about manifest destiny. Let's talk about Greenland. How outlandish is this proposal?
So, do you think, if your question to me is, do you think it's in the U.S. interest to have Greenland? I say, sure, why not? I mean, it's got minerals, it's strategically located, I'd love to have Greenland. Do we need Greenland? No. We've had bases there before. We have one base there now. Danish government has no problem with our expanding our presence there, nor I think do the inhabitants of Greenland have a problem. The only problem is that Greenland isn't ours. And so, with Trump, you never know whether this is just sort of the opening gambit and he's trying to put his I won't say his opponent because Denmark is a founding member of NATO, the person sitting across the table at a disadvantage, or whether he genuinely wants Greenland. If he genuinely wants Greenland and is prepared to pursue it by any means, then he's little different than Putin. Putin was determined to get Ukraine back, and if Trump is determined to get Greenland back in that way, that would make us, at least in my judgment, a little different than Putin. I know you're going to get to Panama, so I'll jump ahead of you there.
But before I do that,
before you
do that,
all right.
The reason I asked whether it was outlandish or not, because I believe it was President Truman who actively looked at Greenland, acquiring Greenland, and Spiro Agnew, Vice President under Nixon, also had active discussions. So that was my question. It was framed in that context. Was it as outlandish?
No, I think, I suspect if you asked any United States president since World War II, would you like to have Greenland? The answer would be yes. And, if somebody, Russians back in the day made the mistake of selling Alaska cheaply to Secretary of State Seward, they called it Seward's Folly. Now we have Alaska. So if the Danes or the good citizens of Greenland wanted to sell us Greenland, I'd line up for an acre or two. But that's not in the offing, and I personally find it unseemly that we would treat a NATO ally like this, and if Trump wanted to send his Secretary of State to have private conversations with the Danes about whether they thought Greenland might be on the market, that would be something else. But to openly espouse that, I think, is unseemly.
But you were talking about the Panama Canal.
Yeah, the Panama Canal. So, I've been actually very interested in the commentary on it because, to the best of my knowledge, not much of the press coverage has noted that George Herbert Walker Bush invaded Panama to get rid of Noriega. So it's not as if our hands are entirely clean with respect to Panama. We consider it in the U.S. national interest to ensure that this vital canal will remain open for business and is well taken care of. By all accounts, that's what's happening. It's open for business, well taken care of. We're not charged more than others. Our warships get to move at the head of the line when they want to go through. So somebody has whispered in the president's ear and said, wouldn't it be nice if we had Panama back? But as someone who worked in the Senate when we passed those, the two Panama Canal treaties, and were able to secure the agreement that ensured that there wasn't active warfare going on in the canal. Some of you may remember that California's senator at that point was Sam Hayakawa. And Sam Hayakawa said, we stole that canal fair and square, we ought to keep it. But that sentiment didn't last. I think again, and Trump would find himself in a similar place, that the distance between what Putin has done in Ukraine and what Xi Jinping would like to do in Taiwan would be narrowed considerably if we were to invade one of those two territories.
I'd like to end with tariffs.
Yeah.
One could argue that there's a straight line from the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Are tariffs, and President Trump has talked very strongly about tariffs. I think he has already started imposing tariffs.
No.
Is there a benefit to tariffs for the United States?
Yeah. So I'm not an economist, and so I have to rely on others whose judgment I trust. What I'm very clear on is that in all likelihood a tariff is a tax on Americans. If China wants to, we need a new refrigerator, and the only place to get that refrigerator is from China, and because we're not making refrigerators anymore, and there's a tariff on it, well, Westinghouse or whoever's selling me the refrigerator is not going to absorb that tariff, and it's going to pass it on to me. So, I just think Trump is living in an economist-free land when he suggests that somehow this is not a tax on the American consumer. Now, whether it'll generate a lot of revenue or not, well, it depends how high the tariffs are. It depends, you can't look at these individually and say, look how much money we're making out of this country or that, until you factor in, well, are they retaliating against us? Are they seeking markets elsewhere? Are they making it more difficult for American consumers to purchase what they want at a reasonable price? What I do think is, and I guess, the mild word again is unseemly. I think it is unseemly that we're threatening Mexico and Canada, our two two closest neighbors, if we've got something to say to them that is provocative, then do it privately over the negotiating table and say, here's the goal we want to achieve. Let's talk about it. But even before you're in office, to get up and say, well, I'm going to threaten our two closest neighbors with these sorts of actions. The final point I would make on Mexico, Trump has just announced that he's going to look at the Mexican gangs as terrorists, give them terrorist designation. There is a risk there. And the risk is any American company that provides assistance to a terrorist organization is then subject to legal action. And so any American gun manufacturer who sells guns, or any store in Berkeley or in Oakland that sells guns to a Mexican cartel, is then subject to legal action because they're supporting a terrorist organization. So, as they say, it's complicated.
Unintended consequences.
Unintended consequences.
So here's a question from the audience.
Yeah.
We spoke about Pete Hegseth's qualifications or lack thereof.
Lack thereof.
But in the Security Council, are there other, in the intelligence apparatus, are there other strong candidates that could perhaps hold the Secretary of Defense up?
Yeah. Meaning?
The CIA.
Oh, yeah. Well, the CIA director has been nominated and confirmed. And he held the position in the first Trump administration of Director of National Intelligence. And so while he wouldn't be my first choice, he's well within the parameters of a decent appointment. National Security Advisor is, by all accounts, fully qualified, and Trump's chief of staff in the White House is also highly qualified. With all of these, you have to wonder how long they're going to last. But right off the bat, some of his ambassadorial appointments or proposed nominations are just bizarre. I mean, he's sending his son's father, who is a convicted felon who has spent time in jail, to be our ambassador to France. I mean, if I was the French, I shouldn't go there. We'll just see some of the other appointments.
So, Cass, you're painting a very bleak picture, a less than rosy picture, but there have been numerous occasions when the Biden administration didn't walk back its position from what the Trump administration first took, whether it was the shifting of the capital to Jerusalem, whether it was a strong border policy, etc. And if you remember, under Obama, there were a greater number of deportations than did take place under George Bush, under Trump.
Right.
So is Trump doing what he's doing in a very obvious level, but the Democrats might have done it on a bit more subtle level? So is it more of messaging than the actions themselves?
Yeah. Well, that's a very fair and good question, and I certainly have had reservations about. I think the Biden administration caught on too late just how the southern border was being overwhelmed. And at a minimum, they lost the political narrative and frankly, more broadly, the fact that we don't have and haven't had a comprehensive and effective immigration bill where people can can come in legally, but there's a process by which you do it, and that is broadly accepted. I think that's a downside. I point out to people that you need, in order to keep a stable population, at least 2.1 births on average, births per family. We're at 1.6. And that has all sorts of implications because it means our population is aging. What is it? 11,000 Americans every day, 11,000 new Americans every day retire and take on Social Security and Medicare. Those get to be real numbers. And so we need an active young workforce, and that's going to come from immigration. And unless we as a country can have a sane immigration policy that brings talented young people, I mean, it's just absolutely nuts to educate large numbers of foreign students in the United States and then encourage them to leave the country after they've gotten a bachelor's, master's, or PhD in an American university. I mean, we should be figuring out any way possible to keep them. Trump has used immigration for his partisan advantage, but we have a bipartisan interest in getting a sane immigration policy. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm making a point.
But we are running out of time.
Yeah.
And I think the program now comes to its conclusion.
You wanted me to end optimistically, right?
Do you have an optimistic note, please?
No, I should. Look, I've spent a good deal of my professional life in public service, and I continue to believe. I tell my students, I was the class of 1968, Hamilton College, which began with the Tet Offensive, then the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and the riots in the streets and chaos at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. And so I say, we've been through rough times before, and we've managed to come out. I just finished a fascinating book on Lindbergh and Roosevelt before World War II, and we turned around from being deeply divisive in 1940 and 41 to being united in the arsenal for democracy by 1942. So we have the capacity in us to turn around and make a positive contribution, and somehow we have to do that again.
So on that optimistic note, let's end tonight's conversation, and let's thank Professor Yost again for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.